Commissioner Sandra Griffiths. Here. Commissioner Sandra Laney. Commissioner King, Brianna King, thank you. Commissioner Arda Rutherford.
Here.
Thank you. Vice Chair Rankin.
Here.
And Chair Matthew Searcher.
Here.
And that's a quorum. Councilmember Kinsinger.
Present.
Councilmember Dickinson.
Here.
Councilmember Hepperly.
Here.
Councilmember Schumacher.
Present.
Councilmember Packard.
Present.
Vice Mayor Hunt.
Here.
Mayor Plaguta.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, ma'am. Moving on, item 2, discussion of possible town code zoning revisions. Mr. Cassidy, are you leading us off, or is Mr. Davidson going to lead us off?
Mr. Mayor, I think I'm going to go ahead and lead you off. I think you all have met me from the presentation, so no need to go into all of that. Mr. Davidson had contacted me about assisting the town in perhaps doing a revision or update of your zoning and subdivision regulations. And so as part of that, we got into kind of a discussion about the realm of possibilities, if you will. We put together sort of an outline of subjects we kind of wanted to talk about, and that's now been handed out to you. I apologize that it wasn't provided a little earlier. But basically, the purpose for this is to talk about your code, what you want to do with it. Those of you who deal with it regularly and are familiar with its ups and downs and how it works. And then basically for us, for myself and your town staff to move forward with trying to implement whatever your vision is for this code. So first of all, I wanted to spend a little time before we get into the outline talking about, well, what is your code? In front of you is Chapter 13 of the Town Code, which is the zoning section. What we'll be really discussing is both the zoning and the subdivision regulations, and those, the PDFs, the portable document format version, PDF versions of those I have here on the screen, so we can look at those. But essentially, your code is like pretty much every zoning code. You've got two basic elements to it. You've got the text of the code itself, and that's this Chapter 13 and Chapter 14, which explains what the zones are, what your zoning districts are. And then you also have the maps, the zoning maps, and those are available on the internet, and I have that queued up here. So your zoning map I'm now showing on the screen, and you can move around the town. You can actually look at where we are meeting. It's just, it's on the screen right here. And when you look at the zoning map, it'll tell you what the zoning designations are. And in your code, the way your code works, you've got not only the land use designations, but you also have density regulations. So that's not very common, I have to say. It was common 100 years ago. The first zoning ordinance that went to the United States Supreme Court, the Village of Euclid zoning ordinance, had that. It had land use zones. It then had density districts, and it also had a third element, which was height districts. So if you owned a piece of land, you would be told what your zoning was, maybe residential. You would have a density regulation, so maybe a 10,000 square foot minimum lot size would be the density, and then you would have a height regulation, which might be 30 feet or something. And you could actually, in the Village of Euclid, because you had 3 elements to every piece of property, you can imagine the possible combinations with that. You know, you could have a very large lot residential with very low heights, or you could go all the way up to having a commercial with very small lots and very high heights. As I said, your zoning ordinance actually has just the 2 elements. It has the density element and the land use element. By having that, it allows you to, let me go back to your code and just, you can look at the table of contents basically to see what your zones are. But you can have R1L, which is the basic your basic single family residential zone. And your density code can be any number of things. There's a presumed density, according to your code, for that, or you can have a density placed on you. So when you look at the map, the actual interactive map from your website, that's where you see that you'll have R1L, so that's the zone, and then you'll have a density of 10. Sometimes on this map, it'll just say R1L without the dash and the number after it. And the way your code works is that if that happens, it's the presumptive district, density district. And I don't remember what it is for R1L. I thought it was 3, but I'm not positive, and maybe Fernando. Okay. So 3, and the number after that dash is typically a density. Actually, for your code, 1 through 10 indicates a minimum lot size of 10,000 square feet. And then the R1 says within that 10,000 square foot minimum lot size, your density per unit has to be 1,000 square feet. So you theoretically could have 10 units on a 10,000 square foot lot in the R if you had a density district 1. One thing I wanted to mention is I'm an outside lawyer. I don't deal with your code all the time. I'm just getting familiar with it by reading it. If I say something that is not consistent with what Fernando says, his word is law. I'm just the outside guy looking at your code saying, isn't that interesting? So I don't want you to take anything I say as being gospel. Actually, what I say is, this is the way I'm reading it. As a stranger to the code, you would want to rely on your staff for the real numbers. But in any event, so 1 through 10 have a 10,000 minimum lot size. But beyond that, if you get the density district 35, for example, for whatever reason, that would be 35,000 square feet. There's a 70 in there, a district of 70, and it'll have a density of 70,000 square feet, which 43,560 is an acre, so 70,000 square feet is about an acre and a half minimum lot size. In any event, the way your code is written is it's mostly text. If you look at it, so for example, if you look at the R1L district here, and you say, well, what are the regulations for the R1L district? It's written out in text format. You say, well, how else would it be written out? And we'll go into that, actually. But so it'll explain in a list format the uses that are permitted. It has actually in this district, it'll have some density regulations, but it'll also refer you to a general density section. And see, I haven't even gotten past the list of uses hardly here. They go on for quite a while, and then you'll get the density regulations. And you might notice something different about the density regulations. All of a sudden here in the density regulations, it's more of a table format for the density regulations. And then you go back to the text for other things. The other thing you're going to notice about your code is that pretty much every in every district, you'll have these sections: off-street parking, signs, some have landscaping, and those will be repeated in each of in many of the zoning districts, which is sort of a little bit of an unusual thing. And as I said, there is a general density regulation section, which I'll show you here, if I can make this work. Why didn't it turn? There it is. So that actually puts all of the various density districts on one page. And then remember, I was saying that the districts have a presumed density district, and as you look through, it will in fact say, so in R1L, it actually will say where no density district has been combined, which means that little dash doesn't exist on the map, then the provisions of the D10 district for that one, the D10 apply. So in any event, so that's basically the way your code works. So how does that compare to other codes, you might ask? Well, many other codes use much less text and a lot more tables. So, and if you're a table person, you'll like that. And if you're not a table person, you're not gonna like that. So, I mean, that's just sort of the way it is. But I think most modern zoning codes do have tables. So, for example, here is Marana's code. And it is very table heavy. This is actually the PDF of the Marana code. I also have it queued up through the internet so you can kind of see how they work a little bit differently. But in any event, you can see from this code that there's a use matrix. So instead of listing out in each zoning district, you can do A, B, C, D, E, whatever. This one has a table that tells you the different zones on the top. And in fact, in Marana, they combine zones, because in Marana, instead of having a separate density district, they'll have a residential 1, residential 2, residential, they'll have a whole bunch of different residential zones which combine the density with the uses. And so for purposes of this matrix, they put together some of those residential uses or some of those residential zones in the top line there, because the uses that are allowed in those residential zones are the same. Why would you need to put them in separate places? But in any event, so this is the tabular one from the PDF, and just the way it looks on in the online version is a little different. For one thing, you'll see that you have hyperlinks, a lot of hyperlinks in the online version, which means to say that if you hover over something that is underlined and written in blue, it'll jump you to that section. So this will say, see section 17.3.2, you just touch that, and it'll take you to 17.3.2, and you say, how do I get back? You hit Alt back, and you're supposed to be back. Anyway, there it is. So in the online version, you also have the same use matrix, but because of the way the online version works, you have to scroll through it this way. So this is kind of, anyway, so these are the ways these ordinances work. You might say, well, what's the typical size of some of these ordinances? Your ordinance, when you combine the two, is somewhere just under, I would say, 300 pages, I believe. So chapter 13 is 234 pages. Chapter 14 is 53 pages. Just to give you an idea of how that compares, Marana's, which is table heavy, as I said, a lot of tables, its entire zoning ordinance, including all the subdivision regulations and some other things, which aren't in yours, is 181 pages. So it tends to be shorter, but you got a bunch of information jammed into those tables. You might say, well, what about things like the city of Phoenix? How about it? Well, first of all, so this is the city of Phoenix's zoning ordinance, which I downloaded. It's actually, normally you would look at it online and you wouldn't know how long it is, but I wanted to know, well, this is a big sucker. How big is it? So it is actually 1,151 pages, but they have a ton of different districts. See, instead of separating out their density districts from their use districts, they have a R118 single-family residential district, which means that's single-family residential on 18,000 square foot minimum lot size. So you see they combine that density into the use zone. All the way to R110, R18, R16 is 6,000 square feet, multifamily residence. Anyway, so you get the idea. The city of Phoenix zoning ordinance is sort of like yours. It is a text-heavy zoning ordinance. So the uses are listed in each individual zone. Now you might say, well, what are the benefits and burdens, if you will, of these approaches? Having a text-heavy ordinance allows your staff, if somebody says, hey, I live in the R1L district, what are the zoning regulations? You can send them the pages that are R1L zoned, and they'll say, okay, that's nice, those are the uses. The trouble, unfortunately, is, though, that once you're at the higher zone, so let's say you're at even the R1M zone, it will actually refer back to the previous, to save a little space, despite being 234 pages, it does still save some space by referring back to the previous zone. So for example, right here in the R1M zone, actually let me make this a little bigger so you can maybe see it a little better. It will say under use regulations on the first thing, uses permitted, all uses permitted in the R1L district. So now your staff, if somebody has R1M, if somebody calls and says, what are the regulations? You send the R1M and you have to send the R1L because otherwise you won't know. And it actually combines as you go further on in the code until you get to a point where you'd have to actually have the regulations of about 5 different zones to know everything about that zone. But that's the way many of these work. That's the way City of Phoenix zoning ordinance work. And thank goodness, because if it's 1,100 pages without, even with referring back to uses in the other zones, you can imagine how giant it is. All right, so that gives you some idea of how that is. I also, before we get into the outline, I wanted to sort of show you some of the other ordinances that have been redone in recent years. One is the City of Flagstaff zoning ordinance. They wanted to create a little bit of flexibility in their zoning code, but they, for reasons involving Prop 207, which we talked about last time, and we'll get into a little bit more a little later, but Prop 207, and I'm not talking about the marijuana proposition, by the way. This is the Private Property Rights Protection Act from 2006. When it was adopted, it prohibited local governments in Arizona from reducing the value of properties through zoning. So as a result of Prop 207, the reaction of most government people is, well, the only good zoning now, or legal zoning, or one that's safe under Prop 207, is one that increases people's development rights. You can't take away development rights without getting a 207 claim. Because of that, Flagstaff, even though they wanted to do some innovative things, they knew they were going to have a Prop 207 claim if they did. So they created extra zones that were optional. They called them transect zones. So if you look at the City of Flagstaff map, which is this zoning map right here, you have regular zones, and then if you turn on the transect zones, you'll see that some portions of the city, it takes a minute for it to load, also have these optional transect zones, but they're optional. So essentially, a property owner in those areas can either have the underlying zoning or they can opt for the transect zoning. And that's become kind of a common feature in some Arizona zoning codes. City of Tucson also has that. If you'll remember, they got light rail put in from the University of Arizona into downtown. So now they have that nice little light rail system. And to increase ridership and things, they thought, the city of Tucson thought, you know, we should probably densify the development along that light rail. So they created an overlay district and they put this overlay zoning over the area where that light rail was. And they said, you know, in that area, a property owner can choose either to use their existing zoning or to use the overlay regulations. The overlay regulations allowed much more dense uses, higher buildings, but also required property owners to have much higher level of design features and other elements. And it has worked. If you've been to Tucson in the last 10 years, and in particular the last 5 years, you'll see there's a lot of densification around the light rail. So those are options you can use. In Marana, we did that for our downtown area. Again, we were afraid of Prop 207 claims if we just switched the zoning on everybody in the downtown area. So we created an overlay and said, in that area, you can opt to use the overlay. So that's how some of these regulations work. We could talk a lot more about some of the ways that your code works, and I'm sure we will get into it with the outline, but I wanted to give you at least an overview of how things looked across the state. I have a bunch of other ordinances available if you'd like to see them. Oh, there was one thing I wanted to show you just because it's bizarre, is in the city of Tucson, their zoning ordinance is, and I didn't download this or anything, so I can't tell you how exactly long it is, but under theirs, it's they have so many hyperlinks in it that you get lost. So when you're looking, if for some reason it's not really coming up here, it's giving me the little hour, the dreaded hourglass here. But in any event, if it does come up, you'll see that every time a defined term is used, and when I mean defined term, I mean something like the word zone. And you can imagine how many times the word zone appears in a zoning ordinance. Every time that appears in the Tucson zoning ordinance, it's underlined with it has a different color, and that means you can hover over that word and it'll give you the definition. So on one page, you might have zone, the word zone appear 10 times. You can hover over any of those 10 times and it'll give you the same zoning definition. It's just kind of overkill. Then they also have similar underlining for cross-references to other sections of the code, and that works the same way as I was showing you with the Marana code, where you touch on that feature and it'll jump you to that other section. One of the troubles with that, by the way, though, especially in the Tucson zoning code, is that after about the fourth jump, you can get lost. So you might be looking at a matrix or something and it says, see the regulations for home occupations. You jump to the home occupation section. Well, in the home occupation section, it'll say, well, but your front yard requirement will be found in this section. So you jump to that section and then it'll say, but if you have an apartment, the front yard for that is in the apartment section. So now you jump to the apartment section and now you're lost, because you were looking at the matrix originally. So there is that potential problem as well. So anyway, so that's just a quick, very quick overview. Getting back to your map, one of the things about your map is that it maps the zoning districts, but it doesn't actually map your density districts. So what I'm showing you right here is part of the neighborhood basically to the north of us. And you'll see that in the salmon color shows that it's R1L, but some of this is R1L10 and some of it's R1L12. And as you look through this neighborhood, you see various times when it says R1L10, various times it says R1L12. I have no idea which particular parcel. It probably doesn't make much difference because there's not that much difference between those zones. It's 10,000 square feet or 12,000 square feet, and probably most of those lots are 12,000 square feet anyway, but it does sort of point out one of the weaknesses of using these two separate kinds of interchanged designations. So with that, what I'd like to do, now that I gave you that sort of overview, and you're all still sort of awake, although I think Commissioner Griffiths was probably snoozing a little bit there. I'm sorry. But, oh, okay, all right. Oh, no, I'm sorry. In any event, so I just wanted to sort of give that to you as a little bit of background before talking about what you would like to see as council members and commissioners. And I know that Board of Adjustment members are here as well. But you know, if you have a pet peeve or whatever, and we only have really until 5 o'clock, and so I don't think we're going to get through this outline. But we'll just go as far as we can. I think from my view, as long as we get through item 3, which again highlights some of the legal considerations, I think we're good to go. But the main purpose for this is to get kind of your feedback on what do you think, what do you like about your regulations, what do you not like, what would you like to see change? So with that, I'll just turn it back to the mayor for your feedback at this point, if you don't mind.
Mr. Cassidy, I first wanted to thank you for being here. You coming in strong, kind of like Ms. Griffith down there as a hurricane category 5. So I appreciate your energy and I appreciate what you have going on. So I'll lead it off with what do we like, what don't we like? As I'm sure you've seen, it's written pretty archaic. It's almost as if it was produced on microfiche, and that's what we're actually seeing in a PDF form on the internet. One of the examples I use is up until just recently, we had tattoo shops listed as only being allowed in M1, which, as you can imagine, they're everywhere. They're on Gurley Street, they're in downtown Scottsdale, they're on Mill Avenue, but we had them listed where they could only be in an industrial zone. It's just an example of small things like that were hindering people, and but since we've been able to change that, we've had 2 tattoo parlors opened up, and they've done great jobs in just basically renovating their space and adding something to the community. So I think as you go through this, I think looking for those things that, I mean, I'm just looking at what you have on the page right now. We have an ordinance that was originally written in 1979, but then amended in 1995. It's things like that I think we just need to address. And I think as we go through this, there's things such as small, tiny home options that were never even thought of 5 years ago. So we can't blame the architects of this. We just need to be able to move forward and just not look back. So I think that's important. And it gives the flexibility, and it gives the members of planning and zoning that opportunity to work within those parameters as we move forward. And I think some of the challenges that you've outlined is how do you change what's already been established without hurting someone? And then what Flagstaff's done, what Tucson's done, I know even Tempe's done it, where they've tried to modify it to make things, give them the option, give the owner the option so they don't feel like they're wronged. I think moving forward, we just have to see what that looks like, and that's a fine line, and you have a lot of work in front of you.
Yes.
Mr. Zurcher, would you like to add anything?
No, I've gone through this numerous times in the past, and it reads like stereo instructions, and so it definitely, if you want some reading material before you go to sleep, this is definitely one of the things you can read, and you'll fall asleep rather quickly. So definitely, I definitely think we need to streamline this and just modernize it and bring it forward. And I'm glad that we are doing this today to discuss this.
Thank you.
Council, Vice Mayor?
So we're talking about a total rewrite, right?
Rewrite, right?
Right?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, Madam Vice Mayor, it would be a total rewrite of so it would look different, but the permitted uses would not be less than what they have now. And I would not recommend that you would change the underlying zoning categories even because of the notice requirements
Right.
and the interaction with the property owners. So I would recommend that you would keep like the R1L, but the question might be whether you would just make it R1L without the dash whatever, and essentially consider simplifying the approach to the density districts might be one thing. But no, at the end of the day, it'll look totally different, but for a property owner and, hey, what can I do with my property? The answer should be you can do everything you could do before and maybe just a little more. I mean, one of the things like about the tattoo parlor that you get into with the text-oriented ordinances is that you might have had 30 years ago somebody who says, hey, we need to address tattoo parlors, and they happen to have a particular zoning. They say, oh, let's just put it in that zone. Whereas if you have a table of uses, normally what happens is people will say, oh, okay, what zones should this fit into? You know, you'd put it into the table and you'd look at all the zones and say, this makes sense in this group of zones, you see. So it's easier to do more global changes as new things come up. Tiny houses, you know, maybe you would make a global change addressing tiny houses. That would actually increase the number of uses people have, not reduce them.
So we can add permitted uses, we can add conditional uses, and we can totally change. I mean, our landscaping, I've never seen the requirements anyway. They are the barest minimum landscape requirements I've ever seen anywhere. So we can change that, right?
Mr. Mayor, Madam Vice Mayor, yes, you can. Now, those kinds of regulations, landscaping and such, it is possible to get a 207 claim by increasing the landscaping regulations, but it's not common. A lot of places do, in fact, change things like landscaping. A very common change is changing processes. You see, procedures with how you do things, those typically don't change the value of somebody's piece of property, so they don't result in a 207 claim. The same with landscaping. Landscaping tends to improve property values. You could get an argument that, yeah, but now it costs me more to do the product, and I have an appraiser here who tells me that my property's now worth $10,000 less because of the landscaping. But I don't think you're going to get that.
Well, and then same with design standards. We don't have any design standards right now, none. And so we could maybe add some of that too, because that would increase the value.
Mr. Mayor and Madam Vice Mayor, yes, that's right. It is very common to add design standards. I would advise that you would want to be as what we call ministerial as possible about that, which means write the rules clearly enough so that everybody knows what the design requirements are and not make it be subject to somebody's interpretation. I think the times that municipalities get into trouble with that is if the design standards say it's got to be pretty and you got to go to the design review committee and they'll tell you what pretty is.
So I appreciate you saying the processes, because I think some of our processes now are kind of confusing. Like at planning and zoning, you're allowed to take a change of zone or a preliminary plan, and then they act on it, and then the preliminary plan and the zoning come to us, and we approve the zoning. Then the developer goes back and works on the final plan, skips planning and zoning, and comes straight to council. And by then, it's too hard to make any changes to it or ask for any kind of changes. And so I've never seen it like that. I think it would be more cost-effective and more time consideration for developers if we package them together and move them along together like other jurisdictions do. So that process could be changed.
Yes, you can
Okay.
change those kinds of procedures, yes.
I have a couple questions just on what you presented. So on, just for the cities that have the hyperlinks,
Yes.
so that, the way I understood it when you were talking about it, it does not open up a new window. It just takes you to that page within the window that you're in. Because it seems like if it just opened it up to a second tab, then you could actually keep it up and go back and forth, and then you could end up with as many of those open as you wanted to without getting lost, because you wouldn't have to, okay, how many times do I have to go back? Do you know what I'm saying?
That's a great question. So what I've just done here is I've gone to one of those links in the Marana Code, 1733. If you right-click instead of left-clicking, you can open it in a new tab.
Okay. Yeah,
So
because that would be.
then you would,
That'd be really helpful, especially if you had multiple screens going on and you could,
Yes.
kind of see everything at once. And then on the transect areas. So most of the time that is to allow for an upzoning. Did I understand that correctly? One piece more density?
the way the transect zones work, and I've not done a lot of work up in Flagstaff, but it looks at land uses differently. I wouldn't say it's necessarily more, gives you more uses, but the transect idea is to go from the wildlife area, which is essentially transect 1, all the way up to the urban core, which is transect area 6. And so it looks at land use, at zoning differently than the traditional zones. At the end of the day, most of what you can do is pretty much the same, but you have a different group of regulations that you choose to follow. And I think if I have, let's see here, here's the specific to zones, the transect zones. There's kind of a cool little graphic that depicts what they mean. So transect 1 is essentially the urban-rural interface, and you go all the way to transect 6, which is basically downtown high.
So what I was just thinking is, because that would, like you said, they did that to avoid issues with 207. So if you have an area that's, some form of residential, and then the light rail goes in and they want to give that option for more density, well, the person that chooses to stay residential, just a single family home on there, it now ends up next door to someone who wants to make the most use possible out of that transect. Now, could that person in the single family home have a 207 claim because that apartment building just dropped my property value?
Mr. Mayor, council member, the answer to that is no, believe it or not, because of what I affectionately refer to as the Walmart exception in Prop 207. And the reason I refer to it that way is before Prop 207 came forward, there was an earlier version of the Property Rights Protection Act that said any land use decision that changes the value of your property will give you a claim for diminution. Folks like Walmart came forward and said, you know what, every time I put a big box in a community, every residence around the big box says that their value went down. So if you leave that statute the way you've got it written, it's going to create a lot of claims. So Prop 207, as adopted, said that you can only have a claim if the regulation you're arguing about was imposed on your property. And in the case that you just described, it's optional whether you impose that overlay zone on your own property, but once you impose it on your property, even if your next door neighbor hates it, it's not imposed on their property, so they don't have a 207 claim. So,
Okay, thank you.
sure.
Are you kind of using overlay and transaction interchangeable?
Well, in the way we're talking about them, Madam Vice Mayor, yes, they are sort of
Okay.
interchangeable, except that the way Flagstaff uses the transect zones, those are overlaid, I use that word, overlay. The map shows the transect 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6 zones in distinct areas. So if I were to show you this zoning map of Flagstaff, you can see that the particular transect zone has its own particular color. Whereas in downtown Tucson, the overlay zone that I was talking about there, that is just sort of a blob over a geographic area. So normally it's the blob over the geographic area that we refer to as an overlay.
Right.
Whereas the transect zone is an alternate zoning designation. They work very much the same, though. I mean, because the overlay is also an alternate zoning designation. So yes, you can think of them similarly. Anyone else have a
We'll just keep it-
particular
keep it moving,
dislike
Mr.
or like?
Just
No,
keep plowing
okay.
along, Mr. Cassidy.
The next item we wanted to open it up to was that the manager also was asked to weigh in. And so, of course, he's the one who got it all rolling for us. And many of his comments are similar to the mayor's comments. So what he would like to do is obviously modernize the language of the code, cross-check the uses, update the zoning categories, make them consistent with what you intend for the community to reflect and how you want the community to be developed. Also to update the development standards, make sure that standards for, and this is mostly in the chapter 14 area, but in any event, make sure that your various development standards, sidewalk, street design, drainage, yada, yada, are what you want those to be. Just take a look at those and ensure that they're fine. The third item I have listed here under Romanet 2 is add residential and commercial design standards. And so that kind of addresses what the vice mayor was talking about. There are many places that have at least some basic residential and commercial design standards. And the hope is that you would avoid, for commercial, just as an example, tilt-up concrete walls that go on 100, 200 feet or whatever, that sort of thing. Requiring electric vehicle or consider, there's a question mark after some of these, then that's to say, how do you feel about it? But in any event, consider maybe requiring electric charging stations for certain size developments, particularly commercial developments or even apartment complexes, requiring that they have electric vehicle charging stations. The tiny home and small home option regulations, considering those, perhaps. Water conservation provisions. The city of Tucson, for example, has an option for water collection and reuse. So that's one option, but there are many, many others. And looking at best practices for that. The next one has to do mostly with securing a vision for a walkable and amenity-connected, if you will, community. There are many communities now throughout the state that have connected amenities. The one I remember best early on is in Scottsdale. You have the Indian Bend Wash. When I was first starting out as a lawyer, believe it or not, I spent 6 months in Scottsdale working for a little tiny law firm, and we lived right next to that Indian Bend Wash. It was awesome. You could ride or run or whatever up and down that. And now throughout the state, we've got a lot of those amenities. So down in Pima County and Marana area, we have a whole interconnected set of bike paths along the that go along the rivers and then also connect into major park hubs and things like that. You can ride, over 100 miles in the Tucson area and stay on the bike paths. So, of course, they come with some of their own issues, but in any event, it's a wonderful amenity. So one of the considerations would be whether to look at having a park plan and interconnecting them. And once you have that, when some development comes in, especially at the rezoning stage, when they're asking for entitlements, you can say, hey, we've got this park plan. How is your development going to connect into that? And it's kind of a nice community amenity, that sort of thing. So those were the subjects. I don't know if Gilbert wanted to expand on some of those. Oh, another one is looking at the PAD zoning. When you look at your map of the zoning categories in Prescott Valley, you will see, that's Flagstaff, of course, but you'll see a bunch of PAD references. So, for example, and it gets a little bit kind of a mouthful here. So, right in this area I'm showing you right here is R1L-10 PAD. So what that means is it's the R1L zone, density district 10, but it has a PAD overlay on it. So in your community, the PAD is an overlay, and it's an overlay of regulations that the developer brings to you. In other words, the developer says, I want to have a more flexible product, so I'm going to show you these PAD regulations. In your community, those PAD regulations have to be placed on some other zoning. In many other jurisdictions, I think most other jurisdictions, certainly the ones I've worked in, you don't have to place them over an existing regulation. Now, what that does is that means that the developer gets to write the entire zoning code, if you will, for their property.
Which ultimately, though, gets approved, though, first. They just don't get carte blanche.
Mr. Mayor, absolutely. It still comes through the whole process. You're the ones who approve it or not. And it allows the developer great flexibility. It's been used primarily, well, I shouldn't say primarily, but one of the things it's been used to do is to bring mixed uses. Like if a developer has a vision for a particular mixed use product, you can imagine the developer trying to fit that into zoning categories established by the government. It's just very hard to do. It's easier for them to write their own zoning regulations. And in most communities, there's no underlying zone. You can put in to the PAD or down in Marana and Pima County, we call them specific plans. You can put into the specific plan something that says, okay, for the single family residential area, this specific plan is going to use the R1 zoning regulations. So it can incorporate some of the zoning regulations that the city or town already has, but it can also simply rewrite them.
But, Mr. Mayor, usually the PAD standards that a developer would bring us are over and above the minimum standards of the zoning designation, right?
I've not been involved in your PAD
No,
process.
but they should be.
Yes.
If we're giving them the ability to do more, then the standards should be over and above what the minimum are in the design manual or whatever they bring us extra.
Mr. Mayor, Madam Vice Mayor, yes, I would think so. I mean, that's typically what they'll do is they'll have a vision for their master plan community, and it will have literally design standards. A good example of this is Verrado. We went out and studied Verrado when our council literally took a trip out there to see how it worked. In Verrado, they had a vision, especially when it was first conceived, of having front porches, requiring that there be front porches. And you'd be amazed at how wonderful, I mean, in my view at least, maybe some people hate it, but I just loved it. I almost told my wife, hey, let's move to Verrado. But anyway, so yes, they had that vision and they created it as a regulation and said, here is our vision for Verrado and this is how it has to be implemented. Gilbert, did you have anything else you wanted to add to the list?
I think the only other, can everyone hear me? Okay. I think Frank, or Mr. Cassidy, I think outlined it very well. The collection of issues that I put here is just stuff I've been hearing from lots of different people, and I kept a running list. So things specifically like the electric car charging, that is, and that's something we could explore with Mr. Cassidy. It doesn't always have to be a regulation of a stick. We can use carrots as well to incentivize certain things. The last point that I had of like parks, that's another area where the commission and the council can get very creative, where if a developer wanted greater density or a project came in and said we want a greater density, okay, that's fine. But to do that, you've got to have greater open space requirements or greater park amenities and those things. So there can be trade-off type things that can be embedded into the code so it's clearly laid out, the options that they have. So that was kind of my list that I wanted to provide.
On your water conservation, is that kind of a broad term that also covers stormwater management?
Yes,
Okay.
Mayor, Councilor, yes.
What I'd like to do then is to continue on with the outline and sort of talk about some of the legal considerations. We've already talked about the diminution claims, the Prop 207 claims, and in response to council members' question, I did explain that there's no claim for decreased property on for changes that happen on somebody else's land. But bottom line for it really is that after the update, the zoning entitlements really should give a property owner, if we've done it correctly, the same or slightly more rights to use their property than they have before the rewrite. You certainly don't want to take away uses from properties. But I did put in here one thing that you can't have done this work for 39 years, which I've done, without realizing anytime you mess with a zoning ordinance, there are going to be unintended consequences. Something is going to happen that you didn't think about. And I just hate to tell you that, but that's just sort of the way it is. So we'll have to try to be flexible. And one of the reasons you have lots of good public hearing and opportunities for feedback is a lot of times, if you've done those public hearings right, some of the unintended consequences you didn't think about will be brought to your attention in that process. But inevitably, you're going to have some, and after we're done, you'll do some odd little, maybe some minor tweaks or things like that. Obviously, procedurally, you're going to have to do all these hearings, but one thing I wanted to highlight again, and I did mention a little bit, is I would strongly recommend that you avoid making changes to the actual zoning designations on people's property. It's fine to add an overlay that gives them an optional change. Sometimes you'll get overlay zoning, though, that only reduces uses. So, for example, in the city of Phoenix, they had in central Phoenix, they were having trouble with, well, they created the inebriate zone. So you can see what they were having trouble with. Mm-hmm. But anyway, the inebriate zone was an overlay zone that said, even though the underlying zoning might allow you to do some things, in this inebriate zone, we're going to take away certain uses. We're going to take away bars without going through special additional hoops, pawn shops, things like that. So that was all before Prop 207 too, though. So sometimes you'll see overlay zones, though, that work pre-207 overlays that work that way, but that's not what we're talking about. What I'm recommending here, though, is that whatever you do, don't change that R1L. If it's R1L, when we're done with this process, it should still be R1L. Now, whether it has the -10, as long as the density rights are the same when you're done, I think you're fine, but the underlying designation should be left the same. Otherwise, the notice requirements for dealing with that are significantly higher. You have to engage each individual property owner whose zoning designation is going to be changing. So you don't want to do that. It's just a lot more hassle and work. So we want to focus on the zoning text primarily, is what I would recommend.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor. So we have commercial zones, like regular commercial zones, C1, C2, and I think we have a C3. We have a C3 zone, and then we have an M1 zone, and the C3 zone is like half commercial and half industrial, and it's really an area that I'm used to having a requirement for conditional use permits because it's a lot of like tires and outdoor storage stuff, and it happens in many areas to be right dab in the center of our entry area into the community, like 69, that should be more scenic looking, but yet we have this heavy commercial / industrial zone. How do we handle something like that?
Mr. Mayor, Madam Vice Mayor, you have a couple of options, but one thing is with Prop 207, if you remove those entitlements, zoning entitlements against the will of the property owner, you're going to end up getting a claim. So, but the options that you have are, number one, you can incentivize better development. So you can say, you can actually reach out to those property owners and say, you know, we will improve the value of your property if you'll shift to this other use that's more attractive for our entry areas, and hope that you can talk them into that. Another option, believe it or not, is that in Arizona, you can use your condemnation authority, your eminent domain authority, to purchase zoning rights. That doesn't mean you're purchasing the actual property itself, but you can actually purchase out the zoning rights. And essentially, that's what Prop 207 does, if you think about it. It's just that it's a little backwards. In that case, you impose additional restrictions on a piece of property, and the property owner makes a claim against the government, whereas in a condemnation situation, the government says, you know what, in this area, we don't want to have these industrial uses. We want it to be reduced down to a different zoning category, and we recognize that's going to change the value of the property, so you file a condemnation case against the property owner and you compensate them up front for it. Nobody does it that way, I'll tell you that, but the statute allows that. So most people do it as an incentive. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, that's okay. And I suppose we could overlay that area with the idea that we want to incentivize or negotiate or something in the future.
Right,
Okay.
right. Yes.
I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but can you also do, like, if you were like a grandfather type situation where you change the zoning around that existing business, and since they're already there, like, yeah, you can keep that zoning, you can keep, we don't want to chase your business away, but we just want to make sure that no other light industrials come to this neighborhood so that we can eventually transition. Like, is that an option, or?
the idea of vested rights is certainly going to apply. Once the undesirable use is in place, it's entitled to continue. And so, yes, even if you incentivize the development around it so that it changes, at least you will then have limited the undesirable use to the vested rights area, yes.
So that, but I mean, I'm just curious, that's an option, or that's like, is there precedent for that, or?
You can, Mr. Mayor, council member, you can do that, but in the process of doing that, the question would be how would you take those uses away from the surrounding property owners? If you downzone the property, you'll get a 207 claim. It would be a situation where you want to incentivize it so that the property owner willingly chooses and establishes a more desirable use. And then once it's established as a more desirable use, if you've done it correctly, they, through the incentive process, they will have given up their rights to the undesirable use.
Right, because even if there's not, the business isn't there yet per se, but they still own the property that has the potential to put the business there. So, yeah, I was thinking of existing businesses only, but of course the people who already own that light industrial land are going to want to keep the uses as well. So,
Right.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Cassidy, I have a question with reference to the multiple overlays, like what you said down in Tucson, they have like 2 different overlays in a certain area where there's railroad tracks. So in this, what we're discussing here, would those overlays be an either or situation, or would they be an in addition to? So if you have one of the overlays, then that's your first choice and that's it. Or would you have an either or where you could have both overlays and maybe make a selection?
Mr. Mayor and Councilmember Dickinson, you can do it either way. The way City of Tucson did it was they wanted you to give up your underlying rights. It's sort of what Councilmember Hepperly was talking about. If you're trying to incentivize away from undesirable uses, then you would want to set up the overlay so that they give up the existing undesirable use to get the incentivized use of the overlay. But you can write the overlay so that it's an either or. And if you're in a situation where you don't mind what the existing uses are, you're not trying to get rid of those existing uses, then yes, you might just say, you know what, along this area, we're going to place an overlay that allows people to do a little bit more. In
addition to.
In addition to. So I was thinking, for example, it was a little later in the outline, but since you brought it up, one of the things that has come out in some of the discussions is that there seems to be quite a bit of vacant land around, Town Hall. And you probably could place an overlay on that area that would say, you know what, we want to incentivize good development here. So if you do development in this area, you can do your underlying zoning, but that might be an area where you would place an overlay that gives some additional rights without making somebody give up their underlying rights at all. So they don't have to opt for the other one. You place the overlay and say, we so want a particular kind of commercial development in this area. For example, let's say you wanted to have pedestrian-friendly, walkable commercial in your this downtown area, if you will. You might say, look, if you're willing to meet these design standards, you can reduce your parking requirement or something. As long as you have front-loaded commercial on a sidewalk, then you don't have to have as much parking in the back. Or you can have 2 stories when maybe you could only have had 1 before, or something like that. So you can place an overlay that gives more rights but doesn't take away the underlying rights. Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, one more, Mr. Mayor. So we're getting ready to take the general plan to vote in November. What if we make an inconsistency with what we just approved? Will that-
Mr. Mayor, Madam Vice Mayor, you would want to try not to do that. Certainly, but keep in mind that if somebody has underlying zoning with zoning entitlements already, then the general plan isn't going to change that anyway. All you're doing is you're taking the existing regulations and updating them. And so you might want a particular area, you might have a vision for a particular area, like the entry area for your community, that it would be attractive development, and you might put that into your general plan and say, this is what we want to see here. But if it already has existing rights, and of course now we're getting into some legal advice, you probably want to talk to Ivan about his view of this, but my own view would be, it doesn't matter what you put in that general plan. If somebody has the existing zoning entitlement, in my opinion, they're entitled to do that. You know, Ivan may have a different opinion on that. But in any event, that's... Okay, so moving on. I guess as long as we have you here, and I did go through showing you the tabular or table-heavy versus text-heavy format, I was hoping to read your reactions to showing you those codes and see whether you hated one, liked one, didn't. So if you could maybe, one of the things at the outset, it would be nice to know how you feel about going to a more table-heavy format. It would reduce the length of the code. That would be the way that I would probably go unless you told me otherwise. But I've run into people who so hate tables that they've told me, I don't care what you like, Cassidy. We're going to stay with the text. So that's the first thing, is to get some feedback. Are you okay with using a sort of a table-heavy approach? Yes, Councilmember Laney.
I would personally prefer the tables. I'm a visual person, and I like to see things, and I don't want to have to go through a whole bunch of rules.
Great.
That's just my own.
My kind of person. Commissioner
Thank you,
Griffiths.
Mr. Cassidy. I as well would be one to support a text document, a table document. The text document with what we're dealing now, it takes you and you have to jump. It says, see this zoning, and you have to jump from this page and then you go to that page. It's very disruptive. Plus, at the end of several of these jumps, you will find out that a particular zoning ordinance was changed and adopted multiple times along the way, so you don't know where to go with that last adoption to see how the code has changed. And most recently, we were able to discover a pretty significant change caused by this same thing here. So I'm all for a table.
Great. Any other feedback on that? Everybody seems okay with that. Okay, all right. So I won't have oranges thrown at me when I...
And Mr. Cassidy, just because you don't get feedback from the dais doesn't mean you may not get an email or two from the panel here in the upcoming few days.
Yes. The other one is the density districts. Is everybody, I haven't really personally dealt so much with your density districts. Obviously, there are presumptive densities for each of the districts. And so I'm wondering how the council and the commission feel about how married are you to the idea of density districts, or would you be okay with kind of going to just the base zoning with saying, all right, the zoning is now going to be R1L. As it turns out, for areas that were designated with lower density, you would have two options. You would either automatically put them into the higher density, or you could say for those areas, the density limitation is going to be carried forward. But in any event, we would try to simplify the density designation process, if that works for everybody. If I can figure out a way to do that without creating a Prop 207 claim, let me put it that way.
Our
seeing
density
one.
districts are causing challenges and problems. I know Fernando can attest to that, what we've been through with patio covers, increasing density and covered porches, and that's such craziness. And homeowners don't deserve to go through that because they have no upfront knowledge what density means and how it affects their lot. So that's a big challenge.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Then the third thing I wanted to get some feedback on is these optional overlay incentive districts. Are there areas that you would want to have them? And this is, we're going to be working on this for many months. So obviously, as the mayor said, you're going to have plenty of time to think about this. But is this something that you want staff and I to be active about, or are you not as crazy about it? And if you do kind of like it, where would you like to see it happen? And like I said, you don't have to know right now, but if you do.
Can I just ask a question on that? I noticed in the Flagstaff one that you showed us, the incentive areas there were in a very old part of Flagstaff. So when that was put in place, what's the sequence of events that needs to happen for that to happen? Or is it just something where we say, now you have this?
Mr. Mayor and Commissioner Rankin, you'd have to adopt it through the full rezoning process. You go through the hearing process, but once you get to the end of that process, you place a zone, and actually it's placed on the map. It'll be an overlay designation. And in fact, if you look at, well, I won't necessarily bring it up, but if you look at the maps of different communities, the GIS function, the layers on the GIS function will allow you to choose either the existing zoning or the overlay. So you tick the little box and say, I want to see what the overlay is, and then it'll show you geographically where that overlay applies. Once it's adopted through the public hearing process, the overlay regulations would then apply to that area, and presumably by going through the process, you would tell everybody in that area, because that you're considering these overlay regulations. You would get feedback from them, and so by the time you adopt those regulations, people will know that they now have these additional rights, and those folks would then come forward. Now, in most overlay situations, a person opting for the overlay rights then does not have to go through another discretionary process. It's not like a rezoning process. To get the alternate, to do the alternate kind of development allowed by the overlay, they simply submit plans. So if the neighbors hate it at that point, there's nothing you can do about it. It's not a discretionary process. The discretionary process happened when you decided to do the overlay. So that is, by the way, one of the negatives about the overlay. Even in the city of Tucson, for purposes of the light rail, having the densification there has helped ridership and has made a lot of things happen. But if you own a single-family residence right next to it, you probably hate having a high-rise next to you when there used to be, bungalow.
Things are a little bit different in regards to Tucson and Flagstaff, I think, when we're comparing with Prescott Valley, just because of how new Prescott Valley is in the grand scheme of things. So for the most part, we have our core town, and then we have our master plan communities that have already been identified on what's going to be going there. And I think spending a lot of time or getting too far in the weeds doesn't really help us as much as moving forward and what it looks like for perhaps new property owners coming into the town and what can be expected of them. Just my thought.
So we can sort of push that to some future consideration then. Another thing that I wanted, a completely different subject now, that I wanted to talk about a little bit is to get your feedback on zoning authority under your code. And this, you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, most zoning codes are very clear about who has the final word on what the zoning code means. And by state law, in fact, it says that's the zoning administrator. State law doesn't tell you who has to be the zoning administrator. It's just that whoever ends up being the zoning administrator, that's the person who makes the final interpretation of the zoning code. So when somebody says, hey, I'm permitted to do this on my property, they need a final answer from somebody. And by state law, that's the zoning administrator. The reason that's important is once that zoning administrator gives that opinion is appealable to the Board of Adjustment. And then the Board of Adjustment gets to hear that interpretation, and they get to reverse it if they decide they want to reverse it. And then it goes from the Board of Adjustment into court. So that doesn't even come to the council. See, that's the way the statutory process works. In Prescott Valley, however, it appears that interpretations, it says, are made by the town manager or designee. Now, that's not that uncommon to say that the town manager or the city manager identifies who the zoning administrator is, but by writing it the way it's written,
It's not clear.
I look at it and say, well, does that mean that if the manager said, let's say it's going to be Fernando who does that function, but if the manager disagrees with that and he writes an opinion about it, since the code says town manager or designee, in my view, there's a good argument that the town manager has the final word on it, which is, if you want that, that's okay. But I would say, let's make that absolutely clear in the code. I think it's important in any code to know who has the final word and whose final word gets appealed to the Board of Adjustment. So that'll be one thing. You don't have to answer that now, but that's one of the things that I would recommend that you do. Another thing that I would recommend that you do is when you look through your code, as I mentioned, in each of the zones, you'll have a section on signs, like signs, off-street parking. Some of them have landscaping, yada, yada. Combine all those into one place so that you don't repeat that all the time. So try to avoid repetition in the code whenever possible by putting all the relevant regulations into one place, and then to say, these apply everywhere. And then if you don't want to apply them in one place, you'd say, these apply everywhere except this zone, maybe. But nevertheless, at least all the sign provisions would be one place. You wouldn't have to look in a particular zone to find them. So unless people have objection to that, I would probably suggest that you move in that direction. There are some instances in your code, and it's not that uncommon, so it's not necessarily a criticism, but that you have regulations in the definitions. And so you'll be reading through a definition, and all of a sudden you realize, oh my gosh, this isn't just a definition of hotel room, for example. All of a sudden there's a provision that says, for density purposes, density calculation purposes, 2 hotel rooms is 1 density unit. And I think to myself, oh my gosh, that's a substantive regulation. Why would you put that in the definition? So there might end up being exceptions to this, but generally, I am, unless you tell me otherwise, I'm going to remove regulations as much as possible from definitions. So, and I'm not seeing anybody complaining about that, but maybe once we're involved in it, you might say, well, I like it there, and then we'll leave it, whatever. We'll have time to go through those sorts of things. There are certain general regulations that I think ought to be put in a set of general regulations. One is that you'll find home occupations, conditional home occupations, various home occupations, they'll be in the R1L zone. The reason that R1L zone is so long is that there are a lot of regulations in it that are then cross-referenced elsewhere, that things like home occupations, that probably ought to be in a separate area. So unless you have objection to that, I think we're going to move in that direction. And I don't see any objection to that. The next section is the subdivision process, and we did talk a little bit about this before, but, and I need to get into a little more weeds with your staff about how they actually do this, but you actually have a regulation in your subdivision regulations called the Master Development Plan, and it's in the subdivision regulations, and it says that the town can make a party do one of these master development plans even over land that they don't control. Now, the idea is good, I suppose, that, for example, for traffic purposes, you might want to say, well, if you're developing this area, I want to have the bigger picture for what's happening before I approve something, that's all fine. But for purposes of the subdivision regulations, by definition, subdivision, you only submit a subdivision plat on land you own and you control. And I think we need to move to clarity on that. I think it's not clear, in my view, at least from the way I'm reading your regulations, it's really not that clear in yours. And in fact, like I said, the Master Development Plan regulation comes right out and says that the town can impose this requirement even on lands you don't own. So you're submitting a map that includes lands that you don't own. That's troubling to me. I don't think we want that. And maybe the concept is carried forward, but carried forward in a little bit of a different way and not in the subdivision regulations. So that would be something I would recommend. The other thing is considering streamlining some of the platting process. One of the things I've seen in a lot of places, and I've observed it in your code, is that a casual reader of your code might believe that the subdivision process is discretionary. In other words, that, let's say I'm in a neighborhood and I have a big vacant lot next to me, right? And all of a sudden, a subdivision plat is submitted to the town of Prescott Valley, and I hate the way it looks. I hate the street layout. I hate the fact that, there are funky looking lots that front on my lot. I come in to you and I say, don't approve that plat. I hate it. It shouldn't be designed that way. Reading your code, a neighbor might think that you have that authority, but I'm here to tell you, you don't have that authority with subdivision plats. So I would recommend, just for clarity's sake, and so that you can protect yourself from people who think that you can deny plats when you can't, that you would want to rewrite your subdivision regulations so that it's absolutely clear to any casual reader that this is like checking a book out of a library. It's like getting a building permit for your house. There's not a discretionary element involved. The question is, do you meet the building code before getting a building permit? When you're checking a book out of the library, have you violated the library rules? Have you checked out too many books? No, if you haven't, there's no discretion. The person at the front desk can't say, I'm concerned about this book. I'm just not going to let you take the book out. No. Same with the subdivision process. You have your rules written. They explain what the requirements are to get a subdivision plat, and then it gets approved. By state law, it does need to come to you. I mean, it needs to come to the council for approval, but unless you can tell the subdivider what's wrong with that plat, in other words, something that your staff missed, unless your staff made a mistake on it, you're probably going to be approving, you should be approving that plat. Now, I went to all that length, but there are times where the subdivision plat, like if it's part of a PAD or in where I come from, the specific plan, there are sometimes you can say, no, that plat needs to be consistent with these additional rules that you wrote for your property. That's okay. You can, in fact, make a developer comply with whatever the actual rules are, even if they're added on rules from their zoning entitlements. But I think it's better for everybody for people to understand that subdivision rules are a different variety than a rezoning where you have a lot of discretion. So unless you have objection with that, I would go in that direction. And then finally, and I can't believe that we're going to get through all of this, but nevertheless, the final thing is sort of a rules of style and standardization thing. And you know, you can decide whatever you want on this, but it's nice to have consistency. And I noticed that in your code, for example, numbers. If you have a brewery, it says how many gallons, it writes out into the thousands of gallons in longhand how many gallons you can have. Why wouldn't you put that in numbers? I mean, I don't know. It's just bizarre to me that it doesn't say, okay, you can have 10,000 gallons or whatever the gallonage is, and you would put it in numerals instead of spelling the whole thing out. So sometimes it's spelled out. Sometimes it's spelled out with the number in the parentheses, and sometimes it's just numbers. I don't know. I can't tell there's no style manual is I guess what I'm saying. So I would recommend that you come up with a style manual. It doesn't have to be the rules that I've laid out here, but you know, maybe you want to always spell it out. I don't know. But the style manual that I would tend to follow is that you would spell out numbers 1 through 10, and 11 and above, you use numerals. And you don't repeat them. You don't say 10, 10, you know, right? 10 and then paren 10. No. For percentages, you put only the numeral, 25% with a percent symbol. So, I mean, you have a consistency. So we can come back with the style manual if you like, but I would recommend that you at least have one so that we know what's right and what's wrong. So in any event, so that's about all I had, but now that you've had more time to think about it, if there are other things you want to talk about and want us to look at as part of this, we're certainly open to doing that. And so I turn it back over to you. That's the end of my outline.
I'm just one person up on this dais, but I have complete faith in you and what you're going to be able to bring to this project. I want you to know that I want you to be as aggressive as you feel necessary to carve up what we are looking at or what we have looked at for the past 30 years. So, in my opinion, you have the green light to bring to us, and we'll let you know if, hey, this is you went a little too far on this one, Frank. But I don't see that happening, and I trust you. I trust your experience and what you can do to bring us in a good direction. And Mr. Zurcher, do you want to build on that in regards to the board?
And I completely, agree with you, Mr. Mayor, that, Frank, go for it. I mean, I think you kind of have a vision of what we're looking for, and I say let's go for it.
Thank you.
Do you have anything else for Mr. Cassidy? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a question, Mr. Cassidy, on zoning entitlements. So with our R1L zoning in the older sections of Prescott Valley, we have multiple infill lots scattered throughout that are not built on. Are we able to take some sort of other zoning entitlement and bring it forward to that particular lot, such as, can we bring a manufactured home onto that lot, even though the street is full of stick-built, single-family homes? Are we able to process a different type of building in some of these older sections?
Mr. Mayor, Commissioner Griffiths, you could, but I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, if you want to allow something like that, you can incentivize infill development by saying that we're going to create some new zone and maybe waive fees for applying for the rezoning, but still have the rezoning process to allow that. Because that's such a change for the existing residents that I think that would create some shock. If you just rewrote your R1L to have a subcategory that says within certain areas, we're now going to just, as a matter of right, allow manufactured housing or modular housing.
So would the incentivizing portion be outside of the zoning code, and would that just be a marketing, public relations attempt at sending the word out, what we're attempting to do?
Mr. Mayor, Commissioner Griffiths, yes, you can actually do it that way. You can just adopt a separate ordinance that says, hey, you know what, we want to incentivize development, so we're getting the word out that we're going to have a waiver of fees or have some accelerated process for getting a different zoning that allows more uses in these infill areas. Unfortunately, I mean, because of the way these things work, I think you're going to still have to have, you're going to have NIMBY, people who don't want that in their backyard. So you're still going to have public hearings when you go to change those. And now, one thing you could do is you could you could use an overlay zone for that. But when you go through the process of creating the overlay zone and you send out notice to everybody who's going to be in the overlay zone, believe me, everybody who has a stick-built house in the overlay zone is going to say, I don't want you to create the overlay zone if it allows these vacant lots to have a use I don't like. I mean, that's sort of the nature of overlay zoning, is you do create uses a lot of times that other property owners don't like, and then it goes through the process, and the council, as the legislative body with the discretion, they decide whether they're going to allow it anyway. So
in earlier conversations, we kind of agreed, I mean, there was not a raising of hands or anything, but we just kind of pushed the overlay zone aside. It didn't come out and rise to the top.
right.
I'm just curious as to a thought process. Columbus took a chance. I think that maybe we should take a chance with creating an overlay zone for this and see where it goes. We don't have to act on it. We just have to create it and see what happens. Right? Yes?
I think the comparison to Columbus is a stretch there.
He took a chance. That's where we are.
So I'm just saying.
I'm all about chances, but that's okay.
I did do that.
I think overlay could be very valuable for the end of town center.
Yes, ma'am, I got you. We have to at least have conversation, right? That's good.
Well, I can say it out loud. I believe that the overlay zone could be very valuable for the entrance on 69 and for the town center that we're trying to get upgraded and filled in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other feedback, comments?
I just have one thought on that with the overlay zone. There's some parts of the town that we would like to revitalize, and that may be a way to do that. Also, to give them some incentives, take some pride in ownership, do some upkeep, whatever. That might be a thought. Sandy kind of just put a buzz in my head there for a minute, but that might be something we could look at, just as a thought.
You know, one of the things that City of Tucson did that maybe you could do that is to allow in certain areas that you want to have revitalized to have accessory dwellings so that a person can actually make a little money on having a small house or accessory house on that property and improve the income for that property owner. So there are things you can do with that.
Do you have any experience with cities who have, I don't even know how it would be worded, but requirements for maybe like a larger master plan community to have to put in a fire station?
Mr. Mayor and Council Member Hepperly, I recall that it did come up once in Avondale, I believe, when I was dealing with them, and it didn't go that well, honestly. But you'd have to have a pretty large master plan community to require that kind of an exaction. You know, that ends up being an exaction that you impose as an approval, as part of the approval process. And you can sometimes justify that. In your case, though, if I understand correctly, you don't have the fire department. It's a fire district, and so it would be an exaction for the benefit of another entity. But nevertheless, it's a public health and safety consideration. So you probably could do it if it was a large enough project and you could justify it, but that's a heavy lift for any development.
And now something like that exists for the school district, right? There's a certain number of houses go in, there has to be another school, another elementary school, or...
Especially at the entitlement stage, I have certainly seen requirements, meaning what at the time of rezoning. If somebody's going from low-density zoning and they want to have significant number of units, additional units, I've certainly seen requirements that there be a set-aside of property for schools. I've not seen, however, and I don't think we did this in Marana. I mean, there was a school that ended up being built, but I don't recall any developer building a school as a condition of rezoning, only setting aside the land. And that's the more common requirement also, by the way, for the fire station, would be setting aside the land, not necessarily building the fire.
Say, we've done that in development agreements, and we certainly can impose things as a condition of rezoning, but I've never seen it included as a requirement in the zoning code that so many have to be built after so many houses.
Okay. Chief Freitag's not here tonight, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask for on his behalf, so thank you.
We have anything else for Mr. Cassidy before we wrap it up? Sir, again, thank you. I look forward to what you can do for us. And does everyone have Mr. Cassidy's email? And if not, if we can get staff to make sure that's dispersed to him.
Thank you all very much. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks, everyone.